When I look at a pattern, I like to imagine changes that can be made to it. On today's show, we'll do some simple pattern work. When working with patterns, small changes create big results. A collar treatment, princess seams, and asymmetrical fronts give us many options. When we're building a collection of pattern modifications, these 3 adjustments are great tools to have in our tool chest. All today on Fit to Stitch.
Fit to Stitch is made possible by Pendleton, Vogue Fabrics, Benno's Buttons, Kai Scissors, OC Sewing, Mike Gunther Industries, and Sew Steady.
So this means I'm really happy, and this means perspective. So we're going to take a happy perspective on blouses, and we're going to change them up to where you will shop and you will see a blouse you love, and you won't say anymore, oh, I've got to find that pattern. I'll never find that pattern, because you can do some simple things to make this blouse pattern into something completely different. What we're going to do is we're going to focus on the shawl collar. Our basic blouse, we fitted it. This is just a good old muslin, and I want to look over and see exactly what a shawl collar is. So both have collars, both look like collars, they're collars, but the way I tell the difference is I look to the center back, and a shawl collar has a center back seam. Notice a regular collar, it's called a full roll collar, is one piece. It does not have a center back seam. So that's your telltale sign that it's a shawl collar. Now what that means is, if I hold this up, what you see is that the collar, even the back part of the collar, is all a part of the front of the blouse or jacket. It could be either way. So what we know about shawl collars is they were started in the early 1900s. They were done as a less formal way of dress, but keep in mind that we can do them very simply with our blouse because we already have a collar. And when we take our collar and we learn a few rules that should be in our little tool chest about what to do with this collar, we're going to make it really simple. So, and for those of you who have sewn all these years, and when you learn how to do this, you're just going to say, oh my gosh, and I bought a whole new pattern just for that. I'm going to fold the collar in half because, again, you only use half of that collar. It goes to center back and then it repeats. You put it on the fold or not, it doesn't matter. But every collar piece generally is marked with a shoulder seam. And obviously with center front is the middle of that buttonhole. So that's where I'm going to place it on my front, my blouse front. I'm going to put a piece of paper into there just so you can kind of see the 2 points that I'm going to connect. The collar to the blouse are the shoulder seam, which is again marked. I'm going to overlap seam allowances, and then I'm going to pivot it so that the middle of that buttonhole comes right up center front. And that's it. That's the placement of my shawl collar. This portion of the collar will automatically match the back because it was made for that blouse. The fun part of all of this is the styling of the shawl collar is all what happens out here. All of this out here. So what I want to do is kind of show you a couple shawl collars. They're both, we know them to be shawl collars because we can look at the tissue and we can see that the back collar is attached to the front. The minute we know that, we know there's a center back seam, and that's what the shawl collar is. I can put those together, I can line up the front, and you can see all this crazy styling. This is all styling. So when you go and you see a shawl collar and you say, gee, I just really like that, I want to do that, close it up and try to imagine where center front is and go straight up, and then you'll know how far past it came to the other side. Or, to be honest, you could lay it down and just trace the shawl collar if you had it at home. If it's at the store, it's a little harder, obviously, to do that. But let me show you that there are some variations in shawl collars. I'm going to just put this one on the table so that you can see. The back of this collar is narrow. So if I lay it out, what you can see is it doesn't fold over itself. It just comes over. So that's just all in the styling. Again, I'll just simply fold this in half, but still put the same 2 points where they belong, so that the shawl that goes out here will have a facing, but it actually won't fold over itself. So, so many variations are possible as long as you know how those two place. And then what I want to know is when I connect the two, that all of this portion out here is completely decorative. It's styling, it's the choice I want, and I get to do anything I want. All right, so we're going to leave that. We're going to leave these different shapings, because the other thing that I hear a lot of is women will say to me, I just don't know how to sew it. How do you sew it? So we're going to sew it. Here's my shawl collar. I've cut it, and then I've got my back piece. And what I've done is I've put a pin at center back so that I understand the relationships and where they're going to work together. So let's go to the sewing machine. All right, the very first thing I do on a shawl collar is I'm going to make that center back seam I talked about. So there's my blouse front. There's no other, I would typically sew my darts and all those kind of things. We're not going to do that just now. We're just going to sew the center back seam, but I want you to see the parts. The shoulder seam, there's my what sews to the neckline, and this is of course that center back seam. So I'm going to put that together, and I'm going to go ahead and stitch all the way through. Then what a lot of people don't know about a shawl collar is you actually, and I think it's what makes people nervous, you actually clip before you sew. So again, let's go back to logic, and what we're going to realize is that there's seam allowance here because it sews to the neck edge, and there's seam allowance here because it sews to the collar. And when those two this sews to the shoulder. When those two seam allowances come together, they'll bind up one another. So what I'm going to do, and I've got both layers here, is I'm going to make an angular cut 3/8 of an inch, because that's what my seam allowance is, and I'm going to make that cut right to release that seam allowance. Now you can see that I can sew, I'm able to sew that completely flat, and that's when I'm going to bring in my back piece. Also, when you sew, and it's also why I put a pin at center back, because that's where I want the seam to align to. Also, when you sew with a shawl collar, you need to have the front on top so you can pivot, and I'm going to show you how. You can pivot exactly at that mark, and you'll make sure that it's nice and accurate. So I'm just going to put a couple pins here. When you're pinning, you'll want to make sure that this pivot point is right there where you go from the shoulder seam to the neck edge. So it's really easy to do. It's one of those if you know how kind of things. Then this portion right here completely comes around. My center back, it just gives me a chance to see that, hey, I'm going in the right direction. I'm going to open this seam up because that's how I would recommend you sew it. And I'm going to put that pin right there at that seam. If the first half of this is not lined up, don't keep going. Stop and figure out what you're doing wrong, and then come back, so that by the time you come over here, you can see that that again is where the opening should be. It'll kind of form like a little diamond. Where that cut is open, you have to cut before you sew, and I think that just makes a lot of women crazy. But it's just fine. And then I'm going to come over here and end at the shoulder seam. Okay, so let's sew that. We're going to sew it from, the front has to be on top, and we're just going to sew it as one continuous seam, just remembering that we are going to pivot when we get to that cut point. All right, and this is great for close-ups because I can really see, you'll really be able to see where I'm pivoting. We're going to sew along. We're going to come right to that pivot point. All right, right there is where I'm able to leave that needle down and change directions. Get all your fabric underneath there, get it going a different way, and I'm able to just continue right along. Heading over to slit number 2. I am going to show you another little trick with shawl collars that I think is always good to remember. I'm sorry, let me just get this out of the way. And you're going to line this other section up and continue on. Again, you can see right there I'm stopping at the slit. Leave your needle down, whoops. And then go ahead and line up the shoulder seam. So you can see that second time I kind of missed the mark. And when I cut this out, I cut one side a little shorter than the other because I want to show you something. And I think it's something I love about shawl collars. Notice that when I pivoted, I didn't catch any fabric. But on this side, you can see that it looks like it's completely perfect. Even though you all saw that I was a stitch or so off, I cut one side shorter than the other so we would come up a little bit short. You'll never see it when you finish. And I think one thing I love about shawl collars is perfection is overrated. You just don't need them to be perfect. But also, because you have a facing, when this folds over that shawl collar, it completely covers that seam, and you'll not even ever see that seam. So be gentle on yourself. Don't, make it major, and just do it. And in the doing, you'll just get better and better. Okay. So we are good with shawl collars. I want to take a look at something that was created years ago. Let's take a look at the mannequins and recognize that what we learned was a princess seam. And the whole reason a princess seam was created was so that we could take the same fit, we have a bust dart and a waist dart, and we could create a look that actually didn't have physical darts stitched. Although we all know that the darts are in the seam now, and when the darts are by definition included in the seam line, it's called a princess seam. So again, by definition, the bust dart is moved up to the shoulder or the armhole or the neckline, and it's included into a seam that goes into the bottom half of the garment, which we know to be called the waist dart. But again, the whole beauty of this now is I can have different fabrics, and this is a perfect example of using a princess seam to the best capacity it can be, is because I've used one fabric here and darker on the side. And so what you see is she's just lost a few pounds because the sides of her completely disappear and the color pops in the center. So that basic blouse, again, if you notice the collar's all done the same, everything's the same. The sleeve, I didn't change anything except I took those darts and created a princess seam. And that's what we're going to do next. Because again, as I'm shopping and I have this great base blouse, you see a beautiful blouse out there and it's a princess seam, I can go to the same blouse. I don't have to do any change of fitting. All I have to do is move those darts. So let's just learn the rules of moving them. I'm going to do my blouse front and blouse back. I would not suggest ever that you do princess seam in the front and not do it in the back. I've seen it in retail. I've not seen it on high end. And it's simply because it's a mismatch of pattern. Whoever was doing the pattern, it's just not a match. And when you do them, if you're going to do a princess seam to the shoulder, it should be princess seam to the shoulder in the front and the back. And I've put a little notch there because that's where I'm going to make my princess seam. You can make a princess seam to the armhole. Again, by definition, a princess seam is when the bust dart is moved to the upper portion of the bodice. It's either the armhole, the shoulder, the neckline, or even center front. So keep in mind that it doesn't matter where I do them. I have found that for most women, that shoulder is going to be your best place. And the reason being is because it gives you such a nice long dart that if it's a large dart and we're dealing with D cup, then it gives me a much more, you know, if we talk engineering and you go from shoulder to bust point, you've got a nice long space for that dart to be very gradual, as opposed to the side seam is a much shorter space. So those angles are going to be tighter and sharper. Sometimes my fabric just isn't going to lay as nicely than when it's coming from the shoulder. So I'm going to pick the shoulder. Easy to do. I'm going to make 2 cuts. Pick the point that you want the princess seam to go. In fact, actually what I'm going to do first is draw my line. And I'm just going to draw a line, and most of you, you're going to want to use a French curve. Just draw your line from point A to point B. I don't have a curve here. I'm just going to kind of eyeball all those years of experience and just bring it right into the dart. So that's going to come right into here. Just know that what we have is the bust point, and then our rules tell us we have a bust circle. We learned all about that, but just as a reminder, that bust circle is just a 3-inch radius, and it goes all the way around that bust point. By rules, fitting darts, which is what these 2 puppies are, they have to be in that bust circle. They already are. You're not going to mess that up, so you don't really have to worry about that. I just want to mention it. So now I've got 1 point, which is my bust point. I'm going to cut both of these darts to but not through the bust point. So that cut goes all the way there. This cut here, 1 cut is where the dart is. One cut is where the dart is going. I close up the dart, the whole dart, just like you were sewing it. You're going to close it up. I'm going to tape it closed, and guess what? That is step 1 in my princess seam. Then all I'm going to do is continue down, and I'm going to go to both sides of these darts. Now remember and keep clear what is a cut line and what's a stitch line. That's actually a stitch line, and that's a stitch line. So when you go to make that transition, I'm actually going to take away the seam allowance. The reason being is because once I finish with this, I'm going to add seam allowance to that whole entire piece. And again, the goal is to move these darts without making changing the fit, without making any fit changes at all. So that once I sew these 2 pieces together, this is going to be the exact same thing as what this is, except it allows me now to, number 1, not have to stitch the darts. It allows me to sub different fabrics in the center, and it creates those vertical lines. And what we know about vertical lines doesn't get any better. All right, we know that. So now let's go to the back, because what I want to do is make sure that when I create the princess seam in the back, I've done it the same place as in the front. In the back, I don't actually have a dart at the shoulder in my blouse pattern. So really what that means is I don't have to worry about it. All I'm going to do is cut these apart. Again, I'm going to draw a line from my same mark, because when I sew them together, I want these portions to make sure that they match together. So again, I'm going to cut. I'm going to go to my dart lines, but remember, I'm going to get rid of that seam allowance so that when I put them together, I make sure that I'm restoring the fit. It is really important, and it's why we spent that series doing fit. I think all of us will agree, it's just not fun to spend all of our time making something, using beautiful fabric, doing a beautiful sewing job, and then we put it on and we're not happy with how it looks. And so that process of going through and making sure your pattern works is really important before. We know for many of us, if this dart isn't right, when we move it up here, it doesn't make it right. It's still going to be wrong. Moving it doesn't change the fit. But that will give you the styling change you want. And that way when you go shopping and you see those great ideas and you see that wrap, or you see that princess seam, you're ready to go. All right, so what I want to kind of get home to you, we're going to take another look at these mannequins a little bit, is that wraps and princess seams and shawl collars a lot of times are all merged together. So if you understand that each one is a separate function, I can have one without the other. I can pull them all together if I want. And of course, what we know, Diane von Furstenberg did a beautiful job of combining them all together and made a substantial amount of money. This is the wrap. And the wrap, as we know it, is what we call asymmetric. And asymmetric is simply when we take one side, we infringe and add to the other side onto it, and then we use that side twice. So let me just clarify, and I'm going to kind of unwrap this and peek inside a little bit. If you notice, and if again, I imagine where center front is on my blouse, it probably comes in somewhere straight in there. So notice on this, I've gone past center front, only with the bottom portion. This still is left exactly like it is. I haven't made any changes. But what I've done is I've used the larger size twice so that this side wraps under, this side wraps over and ties. We haven't changed the back at all. But also what we noticed is we created the princess seam first and then we did the wrap. There's no fashion rule that says I have to do that. As far as what tools I use out of my tool chest, it's completely up to me. Again, the advantage of having these princess seams is if I want to paint on fabric, I can do that. If I want to use a fabric that's darker on the side, I can do that. And we know as sewers, a lot of times we buy a fabric because we're madly in love with it, we just didn't have enough yardage. And so, whoops, we can mix and match our fabrics to kind of give us what we want, and we can really get a great end result. So let's look at that asymmetric front and recognize that we'll want to do that. And a couple episodes from now, we'll actually do an asymmetric collar. And you'll really see where once you understand that asymmetric is just adding on, you'll really be able to kind of be free. All right, so with the asymmetric, I'm not changing the sleeve, I'm not changing the collar, I'm not changing the back, I'm only changing my two front pieces. And what I'm going to do is I actually cut two front pieces and I'm just going to put those together. So I'm going to use the back side of one and the front side of another, and I'm going to line up center fronts. So that's really important to do, again, because if I don't, I'm changing the size. So let's put that there, and I don't know if you can see it, but I've got center and front superimposed right on top of each other. And this is where the fun begins, because I can do just about anything I want. My points are, I'm going to go from this point right here, and I'm going to go over on to the other side. A couple rules. You can't go past the dart. Because the dart is where the body changes angles and directions, I'll want to stay inside the dart. That dart is going to be about 3 inches on each side of center front. So asymmetric is usually no more than 2 to 3 inches over to the opposite side. But I can take it from here. I can do anything I want going over to the other side. And then when I cut it apart, I'm going to use the larger size twice. One will wrap to the inside, one will wrap to the outside. Years ago, there was what we called a faux wrap, and it actually used the two sides, the smaller side and the larger side, and they would just stitch them together. It didn't last long because so many women just thought it was kind of fake. So this wrap, easy, asymmetric wrap, same thing. We call it wrap so many times, but it really is just an asymmetric front that's done that way. And I just want to show you a couple little great examples of asymmetric. We see it here. The top portion now is wrapped over to this side and then brought back down. Your rules are kind of, all you want to do is figure out where's center front and where I need to go from there. I love this example of an asymmetric because you recognize that all these little tools are just kind of layered on top of each other. So this time we went way over the shoulder and just came down, and then I was free to go crazy on the fringe and do whatever differences I wanted to here. And then remember I talked about that tank top, and that tank top is just such a cute little value. It's the shopping that will give you ideas. So once you have those ideas, you're free to just look and have fun. And I think that's the beauty, again, of shopping. Remember our new perspective that we have on shopping now, because I don't know about you, but I love this and I know how to do it. It's just lapped here and then over here. I just wouldn't come up with it. I wouldn't think of that. And then of course the two different colors layered on top. I had duplicated this tank. This tank was hundreds and hundreds of dollars, and I thought I could just do that in just no time at all. So those great tools you have. We've got our shawl collar. We've got our princess seam, and we've got our asymmetric fronts. And again, you won't always see them together, but when you see a garment that you like and recognize it, just dissect it, pull it apart, and figure out what it is you want to put onto your base blouse, and you're good to go. She's an artist whose work appears in many homes across the nation. Next time, she joins us to share some of her best-kept secrets for painting on fabric. She makes it easy, fun, and she is certain we can all become fiber artists. Next time on Fit to Stitch.
Fit to Stitch is made possible by Pendleton, Vogue Fabrics, Benno's Buttons, Kai Scissors, OC Sewing, Mike Gunther Industries, and Sew Steady. To order a 4-DVD set of Fit to Stitch Series 8, please visit our website at fittostitch.com.